using this lens of social science, can I now go back and reprocess a lot of my military experience and why things happened in certain ways? And instead of blaming people, start to look at it. There's an unconscious bias that people don't realize, just like Malcolm Gladwell talks about in Talking to Strangers. People don't have that bias. They don't intend to have that bias. They don't intend to be mean. It's just these things do happen in society. That's how you'll have very vastly different interpretations of different organizations. It's because we tend to be blind to our own bias and we don't realize that. And it's not intended to be mean. It's a component of what happens in society. It's not intentional. It's just a coping mechanism of how society works.
Welcome to Your Story Doesn't End Here, the mental health podcast of military and veterans who refuse to be silenced. I'm your host, Rachel, and my mission with this podcast is to be a voice for those who don't have a voice, bring awareness to mental health issues, provide value and solutions, and to change the culture when it comes to mental health within the DoD organizations. Hey everyone, thank you so much for coming back for another episode. Today's guest is Edmund. Edmund has 10 years of military experience where he was an infantry-qualified airborne medic in the Canadian Army. Post-military, Edmund became a senior partner of a private equity firm where he was a licensed stockbroker and wealth manager for high net worth families. He retired from finance after 15 years and now spends his time on charitable boards as well as coaching and capital raising for real estate syndications. Edmund is a student of social science, which has led him to be a big advocate for proactive mental hygiene and peak gratitude-based performance. Edmund, it is such a pleasure to have you on the show today.
Yeah, it's my pleasure for being here.
Yes, I'd love to just hear more about you and your story. I mean, you have so much to give and so much to share. I know we've chatted before this, and man, the wealth of knowledge I got from just talking to you for an hour was amazing. So the floor is yours.
Yeah, it's great to be here. And I think a big part of it is my story really started when I enlisted in the military, and I kind of went going through that while I was putting myself through school, and really didn't necessarily intend to get into finance, and I sort of ended up getting there. It's really more of about a personal journey and wanting to learn more about just my own wealth. And one of the things that I had learned from the military is if you're going to do something, make sure that you can try to go and become one of the best at doing it. That's how I ended up becoming or joining and being part of the airborne community. Just try to get to the pinnacle and just keep pushing. So I was like, you know what, let's just have that big push. So I kept doing that. And I was literally in the barracks reading about finance, and ended up pursuing that and just kept going further and further, and started managing money and started to gather clients and started to do what we call capital raising. It's really client facing, and it's discovered at the very high level. It turns into emotional intelligence, why people make the decisions they do, and it turns into social science. And that was incredibly fascinating.
I love that. And, one of the things that really fascinated me about you when we first spoke was all of the work and research that you've done, especially with the military and veteran community. Just kind of digging deeper into why are things the way that they are, and why do people behave a certain way. And so I know we've chatted previously about a number of these things, but the one thing that I really wanted to center this conversation today around is this unconscious bias that you talked about. And, I remember when you're talking to me about it, it really just like this light bulb went off in my head where I was like, oh my gosh, this is why people act the way that they act in the military. And so I know you've done a pretty extensive amount of research into this. And so I'd love to just talk about that a little more.
Yeah, as I was doing this, I was reading more and more authors that talk a lot about psychology and social science. One of them is Malcolm Gladwell. It's a big one. He has this great book, a number of great books, but like Tipping Point, Blink. But one that really fascinated me is he started to dig deeper, and there's a book called, I think it's Talking to Strangers. And one of the interesting things that I'd seen before when it came to talking about unconscious bias and things like this, it had what we call a very heavy tone of external locus of control. And in the business component, or the business world, external locus of control, it's a Latin term, and it basically means location of control. And an external locus of control basically means that it's external factors that are based on the situation that you're in. And it's like basically blaming others. And if we have a high external locus of control, we start to give away our power and our ability to change the world around us. Some people argue about having a deep internal locus of control, and there's a great book out there called Extreme Ownership by Jocko Willink, U.S. Navy SEAL, and he talks a lot about internal locus of control, which means taking back your power and saying, what can I do in this type of situation to change the dynamic? Well, if you combine that with a lot of Malcolm Gladwell's thinking and a lot of Malcolm Gladwell's teaching, you'll start to understand, you'll start to recognize, okay, if using this lens of social science, can I now go back and reprocess a lot of my military experience and why things happened in certain ways? And instead of blaming people, start to look at it. There's an unconscious bias that people don't realize, just like Malcolm Gladwell talks about in Talking to Strangers. People don't have that bias. They don't intend to have that bias. They don't intend to be mean. It's just these things do happen in society. That's how you'll have very vastly different interpretations of different organizations. It's because we tend to be blind to our own bias, and we don't realize that. And it's not intended to be mean. It's a component of what happens in society. It's not intentional. It's just a coping mechanism of how society works and how certain things. It's a terminology in social science that we call heuristics. Heuristics are mental shortcuts that people make. And if you look up the Google term of what heuristics, it means that these are mental shortcuts that the brain needs to make, especially in stressful situations, but is usually based on inaccurate information. It's all using heuristics if it's an incredibly stressful environment. Gee, like the military, like finance, like Wall Street, very high stress environments, then you got a whole whack of people that are relying on heuristics or not full information. And that's the beginnings of unconscious bias.
So you used some really, really good examples that I want to dive a little deeper into. And you talked about women specifically. On one hand of things, you talked about the unconscious bias side of things, where it's like, oh, how people see different situations differently. But then you also got into that stress factor. And that's what I really want to talk a little bit more about, because you just kind of touched on it slightly, but talking about certain situations where there is a bias against women or, more towards men. And so women end up doing a lot more because of an unconscious bias that already exists from people. And so hopefully you remember what we talked about there, and we can get a little bit more into it, but I'd love to just dive a little deeper into this topic.
Yeah, the first part of it starts again with heuristics of the people in leadership. And when you have to recognize that we have this bias towards our own heuristics, and it's a mechanism that can save our life, especially in stressful environments. What it basically does is we have default patterns that we're used to. And what we will default to is things that will fit a certain pattern to our conditioning, but also we will default to ourselves, what looks like ourselves, because that's what gives us the most amount of comfort. So when you have an organization that's trying to take a culture shift or dramatic culture shift, that can result in risk because it's the unknown. And especially if you add on top of that, a stressful environment where people have to make snap and fast decisions. So they'll take a look at it and say, well, in the past, these types of patterns are what have saved our lives. And in an organization like the military, if we make a mistake, it can cost my life or even lives of the organization, people in the organization. So introducing a new element or change can be pushed, and it can be a lot of resistance against that. So in the Canadian military, I was a recruiter in downtown Toronto, and when I grew up working alongside a lot of women. When I first was an intern in the business world, my bosses were women. I was just used to that, and as an ex-gen, that was just how society. That's how I saw society. I didn't realize that that's not normal. I didn't realize that it's not normal to intern and work for a VP that's a woman, right? That's my norm. So when I started to recruit women as well. And I started to bring people in, and I started to bring in a very diverse group. When I was on leadership courses, with a lot of women. So it was just normal for me. It didn't seem like a weird paradigm. And as I started to do that, and as I started to recruit women into the organization, I started to notice that there was a lot of resistance, and it kind of shocked me at first. And what I ended up doing is that it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, because you're going to have some leaders that would say, well, I'm going to prove that this woman can't do it. And what they will do is they'll start to put them under extreme stress and try to teach them something. But we all recognize, or I recognized afterwards with the lens of developing in social science and studying social science, that there's a mode in our brain called the limbic system. military, very high level military professionals will understand a lot of these concepts. But the limbic system is basically when we're under stress. It's our fight, flight, or flee. So when we're under fire, we go into this limbic mode. And in a limbic mode, the brain takes oxygen away from the frontal lobe, which is our reasoning and learning center, and goes straight into reactive because it's a life and death situation. And that's what happens when we're under acute stress. But we can also be put into a limbic mode in a chronic sense, where you can put it like in an office or in garrison. And if you put somebody under a limbic load, they cannot learn and they cannot develop. So here you have some people come in that don't fit the pattern that people are comfortable with, and they now get put under stress because they want to prove that they have an agenda to prove that this person can't learn. So it's like if bullets are flying and you try to teach somebody a brand new concept, it's not going to work. They're not going to learn it. So here you have a whole group of organizations that are under very high stress and they cannot learn it. And then they just come in and say, hey, see, I told you she couldn't learn it, or I told you this person couldn't learn it. And we got to kick her out because this represents a risk. And then they immediately kick them out. And that's why a lot of those perspectives will happen. I feel a lot of those perspectives will happen.
Yeah, I mean, I can think of really specific examples that demonstrate this. I mean, I remember being in a squadron, I'll just say that as an example, where there were every single person was a certain type of way. And you were expected to fit that mold of this type of person. And if you did not fit that mold of this type of person, i.e., they didn't like the way that you learned, or they thought that you were stupid in some way, they would quite literally move people from, say, the AT shop where I worked to the line shack to go launch and recover planes, or move them to safety or somewhere else where it was like, oh, okay, well, this might be a little easier for them to process because I think that they are not intelligent enough to do the job of an avionics technician, because it's considered more of a high level job. There's a lot to avionics. And so, when you really put it into this perspective of, is it that these people were actually quote unquote unintelligent? Or was it that we were purposely putting them under extremely stressful situations? Or we as leaders were not necessarily adapting to their way of learning? So what are your suggestions to remedy this? I mean, to go into an organization and explain the scientific things and say, oh, this is it, fix it. I mean, that's obviously not going to work. So but you work with people in all aspects of leadership, whatever have you. So do you have any suggestions for what organizations or squadrons or even like smaller shops that are doing this, even outside of the military, what people can do to really remedy this and to hopefully make a change to make it better?
Absolutely. I think a big part of it comes into the leadership component of things. And when you take a look at leadership, it's not about compliance in legislation. It's more about self-compliance. And when we try to convince people about, this is a better initiative, this is something you've got to explain a big reason why these things are important, and recognize that in social science, this phenomenon starts to happen in adolescence. Think back to everybody's high school, and that's when cliques start to develop. And you have to understand why that happens. So part of it is that we tend to use, once again, those heuristics to look for like-minded people with like-minded attitudes, like-minded even look, all these types of things. And the reason why that happens, it's about safety. Because when we get into a large high school, if you're isolated, there represents a bit of risk. It's basically like little tribes that are banding together, that we have similar values, we have similar way of talking, we have all this, and when we band together, there's safety in numbers. And if you can think back to high school where you have that one loner, that person was not really emotionally comfortable or psychologically comfortable. It's those people that had these cliques that develop that ended up thriving a little bit more. And that's how the brain tends to try to draw away from that limbic mode, that security is found in numbers. Now, here's the problem. We as leaders, we have to understand that this pattern is going to happen in society. But the danger with this is that in every single clique, if they're all like-minded, the closer they are, they're all going to have the same blind spot. There's no diversity in thought, no diversity in character. And I started to recognize this in business. I made the mistake of hiring because my mentor told me, he's like, Ed, don't hire yourself. And I said, I got it. I'm totally not going to make that mistake. So I went out and I hired a whole bunch of millennial females. I was like, hey, I'm going to mentor some females. They're all millennials. It's great. They couldn't look any further away from me. And that was absolutely correct. But then I recognized, why can we accomplish anything? Why can't we get anything done? We had a whole bunch of people that were just all trying to shepherd each other, like a whole bunch of sheepdogs just barking at everybody. There was no sheep in the organization. And I was like, what's going on? And then it dawned on me as, hey, let's run an MBTI test, which is a Myers-Briggs type indicator. And I asked everybody to do an MBTI test. And sure enough, all of us were the exact same personality type out of 16 different personalities. I had ended up hiring myself, just looked different, but in terms of personality, we all had the same blind spots and we couldn't accomplish anything. And I started to realize in business, that's a big danger. We will tend to gravitate to people that are familiar to us because that's who we respect. We respect when we look in the mirror and say, hey, that person looks a lot like me. I'm going to hire that person. And that is a unconscious bias. And when that happens, your organization actually gets weaker because you all have the same blind spots and you all have the same strengths, but you also have all the same weaknesses. And that is not a great way to build team dynamics or an organization. It's bringing and looking for that diversity of thought and trying to value people that act and have different character and different perspectives than you do. The more vast they have or the more different they are, the better perspective your organization's going to get.
So let's break it down a little further for the leaders that are listening, because I think this episode is going to bring a lot of value to, especially the current leaders in the military. Because when we put it in this perspective and we say, hey, when you are banding together with people that are like-minded in this way, it can actually create a weaker military. And when you go to a leader in the military and say, hey, you're creating a weaker military, that's a huge problem, right? Because the US military, especially the US Navy in particular, where I came from, the whole idea of it is a show of force to the world. We want to be the greatest military, right? So if we're doing something that is detracting from that, then that is a huge problem. So, maybe this is the thing that sparks that idea in leaders' minds of, oh my goodness, we should make a change. So let's break this down just a little bit further and talk about simple steps that people can do to really, really remedy this. So I know that as a leader in the military, you started to recognize certain things and you started to implement certain things. One of them you said was, explaining why to people for certain things. But what specifically did you do that people can start implementing tomorrow? Things that people can start doing today, tomorrow, so that they can really start to not only evaluate themselves and their own biases, but make sure that they're creating a work environment that not only strengthens the group, but is inclusive of people and isn't, kicking out the people that maybe have something to contribute, but for so long, they thought that they were just the weirdo in the group. I mean, this is like years worth of stuff that people have to undo. So, I think first steps, it has to be something pretty simple, right? Or maybe it doesn't. I don't know. I'll let you explain that.
I think a lot of it has to come with what I would define as strong leadership. And I think it's often misunderstood, especially in the military perspective. People had taken a look, and I was a boot camp instructor, right? So I taught basic training, and people think that strong leadership is this iron-fisted, a sergeant that's going to go around and just terrorize everybody. And that might have been my perspective when I was younger. But as I started to mature, I started to realize that strong leadership is leadership that starts to question even themselves and even their own biases or their own perspectives. And Mark Carney was a governor of the Bank of Canada and the UK. He has this great comment, which is that the wise are unsure. It's only people that are foolhardy, that are confident that their perspective is the only way, is the right way. And that's fascinating because you can come in and say, look, because you've had a lot of people, it's like, hey, I've been doing this for 20 years and I know that this is the way it's going to happen. How can that be correct? But then other perspectives are correct as well. And the best way I know how to explain that is that there's an analogy out there where they have a whole bunch of blind people, 5 blind people that are standing around an elephant. And one of them is touching the trunk and explaining and trying to describe what they're seeing. And this person that's touching the trunk will say that, hey, an elephant is kind of round like this. So you put your hands around it. It's kind of breezy, and every once in a while it hits you in the face. And then you have another person is like, it kind of is breezy. It hits you, they're standing by the ear. And it's like, yeah, it is kind of breezy. It'll hit you in the face, but it's not round. It's flat. It's really, really flat. And then this other person was standing by the foot. Is like, no. There's no breeze. It stomps, and it is round, but it's much rounder than you said. And then you take a look at these three blind people, and they're all correct, but they're all partly wrong. And I think as a strong leader, we got to represent that, hey, I understand that my perspective may not be the full perspective, but I am correct. If I'm touching the trunk, what I see is correct, but it's not the full picture. And I think most people that are experienced in combat and in wars recognize that it is so dynamic and it changes so fast that there are different perspectives that everybody can see. And a lot of the times I've got to recognize I have these blind spots called heuristics. And when I'm put under stress, I will go back into that narrow tunnel vision. And I need to have people that are think completely different and are wired completely different from me to help me open up my perspective and to value those other people and to value those opinions, even if they sound completely different than my conclusions. It's to be able to bring that diversity together and celebrate it and to champion that.
So, two things that stood out to me about what you said. A, it's that not everything's just a black and white, right or wrong thing. I think that the military, from a long time back, has really ingrained this style of leadership and culture where it is very black and white. There's a right and there's a wrong. You say you do as I say, you don't question it, you just do it. And so when we're talking about this culture, and this is the second point where someone that's new comes in and they bring a different perspective and they say, hey, listen, I know you've been doing it this way for so long, but maybe let's try it this way. Leaders that are open to hearing that, and it might not be the end all be all, it might not work at all, but let's try it. And instead of ostracizing that person and saying, hey, like, your way is different, we've never tried it and it didn't work, so you're a piece of shit, we're not going to do this ever again. Being open to this idea of, hey, people bring different values, people have different backgrounds and experiences. I know in the US military, I'm not sure about Canadian, people that are lower ranking, especially in the Navy, are really regarded as dumb, kind of stupid, like they need to learn everything. And it doesn't matter what age you are, you could come in the military at 30 years old, have a whole background of work behind you prior to joining the military. People treat lower ranking, especially enlisted, a certain type of way because of their rank. And so again, it's just kind of going back to unlearning all these things, all these years. But it's interesting that you say that realistically, it all just goes back to safety in our brain. Like we're all just trying to be safe. And, this is a concept that I learned a long time ago, but I'd love for you to just chat a little more about that. I saw you're getting ready to speak, so I'll let you go ahead.
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to come with leadership is a little nervous about, hey, I want to come in and instill confidence in my subordinates to let them know that I know how to do this and I know how to get us, like how to complete this task safely, whether it's being in harm's way or whatever it is. And if I start going around and asking people, well, how should we do this? How should we do that? I will lose their confidence. So I have to be a stalwart at being able to recognize, this person knows, this person's on the ball. It doesn't have to be like that. I think a big part of that is being able to open up and ask people for their opinion without relinquishing your authority. A good example of this would be things like, hey, I'm taking a look at this map. Take a junior enlisted. Is like, when you take a look at this map, tell me what you see. I'm kind of curious about what you see. And if it's a person that's completely different, and then they'll let them speak and take their opinion, take their perspective. It's like, thank you very much. That's an interesting perspective. I'll take it into consideration. And then just move on and then just continue on. Now, if there's some task or there's something like if bullets are starting to fly, don't go around asking everybody, like, hey, Brian, what do you think we should do? Hey, hey, Corporal, hey, Specialist, what do you think we should do? Right? That's when you have to, you have to make snap decisions. But there's other times when you're not under that kind of stress, where you kind of value those other opinions. In the business world, one of the things that you'll commonly see is this massive divide between extroverts and introverts. Introverts tend to be more of the analysts in the back office, and extroverts are all the frat boy, the client facing. I was part of the client facing crowd, and we were the salespeople, and they hate each other, and they don't get along. And for the longest time, I was thinking, like, hey, a whole bunch of these, quants and nerds, they just don't know how to talk to people, and we devalue what they have. But then you go to the analyst side, it's like, hey, these are a whole bunch of these frat boys. All they do is they just go and schmooze clients, and they don't know the first thing about finance. Right? They're licensed, but they barely know how to add, and they can barely explain how the product system works. And they disrespect each other, but you don't realize that we need both of each other. So as I started to get higher and higher in the business organization, one of the things that MBTI teaches is things that you're weak at, and where basically how you can be a jerk in a business meeting. And for my MBTI personality, it's that I can have a tendency to overspeak, especially in a room full of introverts. So one of the things that we really strive at when we're client facing is trying to be have a universal appeal to all client bases. And I will come across clients that are introverts. And if I go and I'm an extrovert and I take all the oxygen in the room, I'm not going to be able to close that client. And I'm not going to be able to talk to analysts. I'm not going to be able to lead analysts and gain their respect. So it all depends on who's in the room. It's modulating your personality type, and it's called emotional intelligence. Having that emotional intelligence, that if I'm in a room full of extrovert airborne airborne infantry people, then I have to be as alpha and overbearing as possible just to get a word in. But if I walk around and now it's a whole bunch of introverts in a whole bunch of quants and analysts, I got to shut up and let them speak, or else they'll not get a word in, and I will lose that perspective. So it's not any one given strategy. It's all dependent upon who's in the room. How do I have to go and modulate my personality in order to get the best out of everybody in the room?
So would you say that it starts with quite a bit of self-reflection, just to see kind of analyze, like, where am I at as a leader? What kind of biases do I have? Or maybe, I worked with a leader one time that asked everyone in the room, can you share with me what you think my strengths and weaknesses are? Now, the downside to this method is that everyone was scared to tell this leader what, I mean, he was a chief, he was an E7, and he was in my shop, and he came in and he was very much about leadership principles. He read a lot of books. He did a lot of things to try to make himself a better leader. And so one of the first things he did when he came in was he disrupted the entire place. He got rid of he got rid of this like bookshelf that had been there for years, and people were upset. He got rid of a couch that had been there for years, and people were upset. And the reasoning he said behind this was, if I come in initially and make a big disruption or change, everything else from there seems minute. And so, it was interesting because it was the first time that I'd ever had a leader in the military that ever like really showed, this is me trying to be a good leader instead of just following what everyone else did. But another thing that he did was he did ask people, can you give me feedback and tell me, what do you think my strengths are? What do you think my weaknesses are? And no one was honest, because they were so ingrained with this idea of, oh my gosh, if I say what his weakness is, he's going to be upset. He's going to, ostracize me. I'm not going to get treated the same. And so there's this huge divide. And so that's why I say, it was the best place maybe to just start with analyzing oneself as a leader and saying, hey, where am I at? What can I do? Because this really is such a deep systemic thing that puts the responsibility on almost each person as an individual, but then there's such a heavy responsibility on leaders to figure out what to do, how to lead best. It's a very hard thing to say, like, hey, this is step one. Another thing that I would say is, maybe if there's books that you'd recommend that people start just to learn more about it, because I think there's a disconnect in people knowing what leadership is. But yeah, I mean, I'm curious to know if you think that, self-reflection is a good stepping stone, or something else. And then any books or medium that you would recommend for leaders to start really like recognizing more of this stuff.
Yeah, and I think a big part of that is because you see that personality, you will see that personal dynamic when people come in, and if you have a very high ranking person, it's like, hey, tell me all my weaknesses. Like if you had a general, like a 5-star, come in and ask her, like, hey, I want everybody to be frank here, and I want everybody to tell me what my weaknesses are. Like, no, nobody's gonna say anything. Like, come on. You think the private, like, there's maybe one private that was about to raise his hand, and the sergeant's gonna smack him down and just tell him to shut up, right? It's like, it's not gonna happen. But I think it's about being words matter, and looking at diplomatic ways of asking the same question, and that's what sales is all about. So an example could be is that if you on board or you're talking to new staff, and if they're junior ranking, then you can come in and say, hey, I want you to describe your ideal organization, your ideal dynamic, a business or ideal team dynamic. What would be a great place where you have a leader where you feel you can thrive in that group, and what is that leader doing and what is that leader not doing? Describe for me what that looks like to you. and then let that person speak, because that person, if they have any beefs with you, they're not criticizing you. They're just saying that, hey, in order for me to thrive, I need a leader that is very hands off, gives me a lot of autonomy, maybe checks in with me once a month, all this type of stuff, and not micromanages me or something like that. And it could be thinly veiled that maybe you're doing that. But there's in that two dynamic, he's not necessarily, or that person's not necessarily speaking about you, but he's talking about more about how I feel I want to be managed and trained. And for me as the leader, I can come back and I can make that decision. You know what? That's possible. That I could probably change that. I can do that in that dynamic. Or you're dreaming. There's no way you can do it. Like that subordinate might come in and say, well, I don't think we should have any leadership. I think it should be completely flat. I should have full autonomy, and I just check in with me once a year or once every 5 years. It's like, that's not going to happen. We can't deliver that. Right. But maybe there are some things that we can do that maybe we can implement that would improve that situation. So instead of making them feel like they're honest, like, tell me where my weakness, tell me how horrible I am. I don't think any subordinate wants to say that to a senior leader. Right. So instead, tell me a dynamic, or describe for me a team dynamic and leadership that you feel you could really thrive in.
You hit the nail on the head there. And what I was really trying to get to was, what's going to work for people right here, right now, to where they can go back to their organization the next day after listening to this episode and really, start to implement these leadership principles. So I think that was such a perfect example that anyone can implement. And it doesn't bring in that personal thing where, you're saying, hey, what's wrong with me? Because you're right. I mean, I think there's so many people in the military, outside of the military, family dynamics where someone has said, hey, tell me unbiased. I'm not going to get mad. Tell me what's wrong with me. And that person just unleashes the whole list, right? Because some people build up like years and years and years of things. And they're like, oh, this is wrong. This is wrong. This is wrong. I mean, people are naturally going to get offended. We're humans. It's what we do. And there's some people that can handle that a little better, but I have seen people that get treated differently after that conversation. And so you're right. I mean, people aren't going to want to go there and say, this is every single weakness, but that is such a good way to learn how to make that better environment without putting all that onto one person to say, hey, this is what you are doing wrong and what I don't like about you. So thank you so much for that. And then as far as, where people can start outside of their work environment to maybe read books. I know you've mentioned a few good books already throughout this episode. Any books, YouTube videos, podcasts, is there anything that you recommend that is great for the beginner, or even maybe necessarily not the beginner, but that just really hones in on these principles that you're talking about?
Yeah, I love a lot of books, like published books. And the reason why I say published books is because if it's published by a publisher, they have to vet the author. And a lot of times the author, and this is what Malcolm Gladwell talks about as well. Malcolm Gladwell talks about a certain level of competence, which he talks about 10,000 hours, which represents about 10 years. So a lot of published books will have authors that have hit that threshold. So that's why I like reading those types of books. So Malcolm Gladwell, a lot of his material is great. I would start with, on this subject matter, I would start with talking to strangers and recognizing it's like, wow, our brains are tricking us. And you have no idea what's going on, right? Another really fascinating book about psychology is Left of Bang. Left of Bang, it's based on the U.S. Marine Corps Combat Hunter Program, which talks about things like heuristics and the shortcuts that we make and some of the snap decisions that we could make that are incorrect, right? That's another great book to go into. What else did we talk about? We talked about, or another one that was talking about leadership. A great one is Simon Sinek's Start with Why. And start with not only your own why, but what why is really important, especially for newer cohorts that are coming through the military and through business. They start to question a lot of, why are we doing this? So in previous years, through the X-Gen and baby boomer cohorts, it was more, especially in the military, it's like, don't ask what's going on. If I say something, you just have to do it. If I say jump, you have to say how high. That was like a cliche of our culture, right? And these new cohorts that are coming through, it's very disorienting, especially for senior leaders like me now. I'm an X-Gen guy, and we're starting to hit director level in senior leadership in the military. We've just been used to being trained that way. Now we try to tell millennials and Gen Z, hey, just do this. And they keep asking why, and it drives them crazy. But I think that that's a big part of it is like start to adjust and start to recognize, hey, this is a good thing for society. If you can't justify why think something is important, and if you can become a leader that can embrace and be able to describe or explain why something is really important, you start to get compliance of the heart as opposed to compliance of the body. It's like, I'm just doing this just because you told me to. Right. As opposed to if I can explain why, then you get compliance of the heart. And that's where really strong initiative can happen, because that's the whole point of general's orders or general's intent. When we talk about military orders, general's intent is talking about this is what we're trying to achieve. And it is designed to empower every single person through the entire organization that if we have to make an executive decision, what is going to move the needle closer to that general's intent? And it sparked, and it's designed, or its intent is to spark that initiative. So if we use general's intent and recognize that if we can lace in the why, start with why Simon Simic, along with that general's intent, this is why this is so important. Now you start to get compliance of the heart throughout the entire organization.
I love it. I think that one of the biggest bottlenecks of the military in general is the people that are regarded as the lazy ones, maybe the ones who don't know how to follow orders, the ones who are just doing the bare minimum. And I think that if we take these principles that you talked about and we really start to implement them as an organization as a whole, that it would really remedy a lot of that stuff. Because I truly believe that a lot of these people that are seen as, the bad apples in the organization, they're maybe not necessarily a bad apple, but maybe the leadership isn't quite meeting their needs because the leadership wants them to adapt. So just kind of a different way to think about that. So appreciate you sharing those books, and I'll make sure to put those in the show notes for anyone listening that wants to check those out. I highly recommend that you do. Edmund, I would love if you would share with us what you are doing these days as a coach in the speaking world. I mean, I know you have so much going on, so please share with us.
Yeah, so I'm post-career, second career now. So I'm post-finance career. I've retired from the industry, and I kind of manage our own personal wealth. And on the side, what I do is I give back, and it's also a way for me to retain and stay sharp as well. But I go and I coach people, especially U.S. capital raisers, for real estate syndications, and that was one of my major focuses for over a decade. So I teach people now on how to raise capital, how to go and find high net worth clients, how to establish family offices, which are very, very high net worth families, and legacy planning, and teach people how to find those clients and how to manage that money and all the nuances of that. So that's what I'm doing on the side now.
Awesome. And if someone wants to work with you in that capacity, I don't know that all the listeners here are into real estate syndications, but in case they are, because I think it's a really great way to build wealth post military, how would someone get a hold of you to reach out to you, or even just to chat? Because you're amazing to just have conversations with, just for that knowledge.
Yeah, a great thing to do is reach out through LinkedIn. So you just look me up with my name. It's a unique name, so not too many people with the spelling of my last name. But that's a great way to start. But if people are interested in just getting started out with raising capital or real estate syndications, another great group is a lot of these networking groups, or a lot of these virtual networking groups. One that I'm a big advocate is one that's on Friday afternoons. It's at 1 o'clock Eastern, and it's actually hosted or organized by a U.S. Marine Corps colonel, a former U.S. Marine Corps colonel. So great guy. His name is Brian Briscoe, and he's been doing that for 2-3 years now. 3 years now. So great organization to meet other like-minded people as well. I would say about a third of the attendees are also post-military as well.
Yeah, and Brian's actually been on the show. So if anyone wants to go check out his episode to hear a little bit more about Brian, he has been on the show, has been posted, and it's a phenomenal episode. I think that for the military people that are looking for something different outside of the military, because there's so many, especially your 20-year, your 30-year military, your lifers, having that option of something is really great. And Edmund is truly a wealth of knowledge when it comes to capital raising. And one thing that you really put into perspective for me, Edmund, is how the skills that I learned in the military, especially when it comes to risk and taking risks, really do translate over well into the real estate space, but really could translate well into a lot of other spaces too. If we really think about it, I mean, the things that we did in the military, we were just building skills for 4 years plus, and so that's a really phenomenal thing to think of, and a whole separate conversation that we could probably go into for another hour if we did. But Edmund, I really appreciate you being on the show and for sharing that value. I think that so many leaders that listen to this episode are going to have that light bulb moment. I hope they do, because I know I did. And the last thing, if you just have any words to leave us with.
I think that a lot of it is just keep pushing, just keep trying to improve yourself, and it's continuous learning. That's one of the things I learned through the military, is accept the fact that you could always be better. And coaching is a great way to that. And one of the examples that I use is like, people can say, like Tom Brady can say, like, he doesn't go in and say that, hey, I don't need to coach anymore. I've won 7 Super Bowls and I don't need to coach. Just tell me when the games are and I'll show up, right? It's changing that attitude, recognizing that continuous personal improvement is a necessity of business. It doesn't matter how good you are right now, you can always be better. And the better you are, the better your teams are, the better money management you can be, the better your clients will be, all this type of invest in continuous personal improvement.
Thank you for taking the time to listen in today. With your support, we are able to increase awareness of the mental health issues affecting service members and veterans today, with the goal of creating positive change. If you got value from this episode, please take 30 seconds to subscribe and share this episode within your own network. Until next time, remember, your story matters, your mental health matters, and your story doesn't end here.